I sometimes find it tricky or difficult explaining to people that I work at a dungeon. Not because I feel any sense of shame or embarrassment about working at a dungeon, but rather that I'm never quite sure what the perfect word is to describe the place. The place being an unassuming family home in a sleepy suburb of El Cerrito called Fantasy Makers that you have to know the phone number of to get the address to. The headmistress of Fantasy Makers tells us to call it a BDSM playhouse. But when I talk about it, what most often comes out is the word dungeon. And I think dungeon has a nice zing to it. It gets your attention. But it comes with a fair amount of semiotic baggage. You picture a dungeon, and you picture gory images of whips and chains, maybe a sub being beaten up or kicked in the balls, a hood over his mask, saran wrapped and immobilized and forced to smoke 10 cigarettes, maybe. And all of that is accurate and true and fun, but I feel like it excludes the stranger and softer fetish scenes that, for me, are what make being a dominatrix really rewarding and special. For instance, the image of a man in a tube dress and how heartbreaking that can be, or watching an executive be brought to tears by the opportunity to touch my toes. For instance, I had a regular named Tim, and anytime he saw me, what we would do is roll around on the floor, fully clothed, like Mormon teenagers in the backseat of a car. And the entire time that I saw him, I never saw any of his flesh, not even his bare arms. He always wore 3 shirts. Or, for instance, I will certainly never forget a certain client I had named Riley. And he was completely unassuming, instantly forgettable, middle-aged, cis white man who booked me one morning to be his yoga dominatrix. And he showed up to the dungeon and held out a single red rose, which he gave to me and proudly told me that he had grown himself. So I led him up to the room in the dungeon, and he unrolled his yoga mat, and I fiddled with the aux cord to put on music. And I will say, as an aside, for any aspiring dominatrixes in the audience, my number one word of advice to beginning dominatrixes would be to always play music during your scenes, especially if it's a long torture scene. I feel like that's what really enables your client to lose themselves and get lost in it. And I have a very fond memory of beating the shit out of a sub to Hounds of Love by Kate Bush on repeat over and over. Anyway, with Riley, in order to understand the session and why it was so memorable for me, you have to understand the state of my mind, or more specifically, my heart during that session, which is that the night before, I had been dumped. And so I was a snivelly, self-flagellating mess that morning. I had been dumped by a man named Nader after I very embarrassingly invited him over to my house and told him I had a present for him, which, if I remember correctly, was a waterlogged copy of Tropic of Cancer that I found on the street. And he responded to me by text and said, "I think I need to reel this thing in." Oh, what a dagger to the heart. So I showed up that morning to the dungeon, puffy-eyed from crying, and I remember praying to the BDSM gods to get booked for a really violent, aggressive session so that I could just release all of my sorrows and anxieties, like maybe someone who really wanted to be kicked in the balls. And maybe I could lose myself in it and pretend that it was me on the receiving end of the whip. But instead, I got Riley and his single red rose. So we began the session, and I started by guiding him into a series of yin yoga poses. And for those that don't know, yin yoga is different from your more typical hatha or vinyasa yoga. In yin yoga, you hold a series of very intense stretches for upwards of 10 minutes. And the idea is to stretch not just your muscles, but the underlying layers of connective tissue. And I went through a period of being very addicted to yin yoga, specifically the moment after 9 or 10 minutes when the pain of the stretch transforms into this heady, ecstatic feeling of pleasure. And I'm not a runner, but maybe it's what a runner's high is like. And I think for me, it was just so addictive, this idea that if you sat with something painful for long enough, it could be transformed into something sublime. So I guide him into the different yin yoga postures, and I tell him to close his eyes, and I start to guide him into a trance, a meditative trance. And I say, close your eyes. Now imagine a throbbing, pulsating ray of light. That throbbing, gigantic purple ray of light is my cock. Now I want you to imagine that cock filling you up and filling up your body with this hot purple light. And I want you to imagine it shooting out of your fingertips and completely filling you up. And he said, yes, goddess. Yes, mistress. And I said, okay, now you're ready. I'm going to give you a mantra, and I want you to repeat it, and don't stop repeating it until I tell you to. And the mantra was, I am nothing. And I watched him as he closed his eyes, and his voice got softer and softer as he said it. I am nothing. I am nothing. And as I watched him and heard him say this mantra, it reminded me of all of the weepy, melodramatic texts and voice memos that I had been sending to my friends all morning since getting dumped. You know, why me? Why am I so unlovable? I'm such trash. And it also reminded me of yoga class. At the end of every yoga class, when you do corpse pose or shavasana, and the teacher tells you to lie down and practice dying and practice death, and how in those moments being nothing isn't an insult, but this ecstatic surrender. Having nothing, wanting nothing, being nothing, being released into the other world or underworld, in that moment, it feels so good. And so, eventually, the session ends. He gets up, I walk him downstairs, and he hugs me goodbye. He pays me, of course. He pays me and then hugs me and says, thank you, mistress. You have no idea how much I needed that. And he left, and I went upstairs to clean the room, and I saw that he had left behind, forgotten, or maybe left it for me, his single red rose. So I take it home with me, or I do the rest of my day, have my other sessions, and I take it home with me, go back to San Francisco, get off at my stop. And when I'm almost home, I realize that I've forgotten the rose on the bus seat. And I was gripped by the most intense feeling of loss and panic. And I remember wanting to run after the bus, as if I had forgotten my baby or my phone. And I remember it was a particularly foggy night. And so I stood there and just sat with the feeling of loss and tried to tune back into Riley lying there saying, I am nothing. Having nothing, wanting nothing, being nothing, and how fucking good that can feel. Thank you.